Hello. So now we'll begin the part 1. It has 6 chapters and in all there are 5 parts. So let's begin. The part 1 is titled From Far Rockaway to MIT. And the first chapter is He Fixes Radios by Thinking. So let's start. When I was about 11 or 12, I set up a lab in my house. It consisted of an old wooden packaging box that I put shelves in. I had a heater and I put in fat and cooked French fried potatoes all the time. I also had a storage battery and a lamp bank. To build the lamp bank, I went down to the 5 and 10 and got some sockets you can screw down to a wooden base and connected them with pieces of bell wire. By making different combinations of switches in series or parallel, I knew I could get different voltages. But what I hadn't realized was that a bulb's resistance depends on its temperature. So the results of my calculations weren't the same as the stuff that came out of the circuit. But it was alright, and when the bulbs were in series or half lit, they would glow. Very pretty. It was great. I had a fuse in the system, so if I shorted anything, the fuse would blow. Now I had to have a fuse that was weaker than the fuse in the house. So I made my own fuses by taking tin foil and wrapping it around an old burnt out fuse. Across my fuse, I had a 5-watt bulb. So when my fuse blew, the load from the trickle charger that was always charging the storage battery would light up the bulb. The bulb was on the switchboard behind a piece of brown candy paper. It looks red when a light's behind it. So if something went off, I'd look up to the switchboard and there would be a big red spot where the fuse went. It was fun. I enjoyed radios. I started with a crystal set that I bought at the store, and I used to listen to it at night in bed while I was going to sleep through a pair of earphones. When my mother and father went out until late at night, they would come into my room and take the earphones off and worry what was going into my head while I was asleep. About that time, I invented a burglar alarm, which was a very simple-minded thing. It was just a big battery and a bell connected with some wire. When the door to my room opened, it pushed the wire against the battery and closed the circuit, and the bell would go off. One night, my mother and father came home from a night out and very, very quietly, so as not to disturb the child, opened the door to come into my room and to take my earphones off. All of a sudden, this tremendous bell went off with a helluva racket. Bong, 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 bong. I jumped out of bed yelling, "It worked! It worked!" I had a Ford coil, a spark coil from an automobile, and I had the spark terminals at the top of my switchboard. I would put a Rayton RH tube and that which had argon gas in it across the terminals, and the spark would make a purple glow inside the vacuum. It was just great. One day I was playing with a Ford coil, punching holes in papers with the sparks, and the paper caught on fire. Soon I couldn't hold it anymore because it was burning near my fingers. So I dropped it in a metal waste basket which had a lot of newspapers in it. Newspapers burn fast, and the flame looked pretty big inside the room. I shut the door so my mother, who was playing bridge with some friends in the living room, wouldn't find out there was a fire in my room. Took a magazine that was lying nearby and put it over the waste basket to smother the fire. After the fire was out, I took the magazine off, but now the room began to fill up with smoke. The waste basket was still too hot to handle. So I got a pair of pliers, carried it across the room, and held it out the window for the smoke to blow out. But because it was breezy outside, the wind lit the fire again, and now the magazine was out of reach. So I pulled the flaming wastebasket back in through the window to get the magazine, and I noticed there were curtains in the window. It was very dangerous. Well, I got the magazine, put the fire out again, and this time kept the magazine with me while I shook the glowing coals out of the waste paper basket onto the street, 2 or 3 floors below. Then I went out of my room, closed the door behind me, and said to my mother, "I'm going out to play." And the smoke went out slowly through the windows. I also did some things with electric motors, and built an amplifier for the photocell that I had bought that could make a bell ring when I put my hand in front of the cell. I didn't get to do as much as I wanted to because my mother kept putting me out all the time to play. But I was often in the house fiddling with my lab. I bought radios at rummage sales. I didn't have the money. I didn't have any money, but it wasn't very expensive. They were all broken radios, and I'd buy them and try to fix them. Usually they were broken in some simple-minded way. Some obvious wire was hanging loose, or a coil was broken, or partly unwound. So I could get some of them going. On one of these radios one night, I got Waco in Waco, Texas. It was tremendously exciting. On this same tube radio set up in my lab, I was able to hear a station up in Schenectady called WGN. I don't know how to pronounce that city. But anyways, now all of us kids, my 2 cousins, my sister, and the neighborhood kids, listened on the radio downstairs to a program called Crime Club. Effervescent salts. It was a thing. Well, I discovered that I could hear this program up in my lab on WGN 1 hour before it was broadcast in New York. So I discovered what was going on, what was going to happen, and then when we were all sitting around the radio downstairs listening to Crime Club, I say, we haven't heard from so and so in a long time. I bet you he comes and saves the situation. 2 seconds later, bop bop, he comes. So they all got excited about this, and I predicted a couple of other things. Then they realized that there must be some trick to it that I must know somehow. So I owned up to what it was that I could hear it upstairs the hour before. You know what the result was, naturally. Now they couldn't wait for the regular hour. They all had to sit upstairs in my lab with this little creaky radio for half an hour, listening to the Crime Club from Schenectady. I got that right. Hopefully. We lived at that time in a big house. It was left by my grandfather to his children, and they didn't have much money aside from the house. It was a very large wooden house, and I would run wires all around the outside and had plugs in all the rooms. So I could always listen to my radios, which were upstairs in my lab. I also had a loudspeaker, not the whole speaker, but the part without the big horn on it. One day, when I had my earphones on, I connected them to the loudspeaker and I discovered something. I put my finger in the speaker and I could hear it in the earphones. I scratched the speaker and I'd hear it in the earphones. So I discovered that the speaker could act like a microphone. So you don't even need any batteries. At school, we were talking about Alexander Graham Bell. So I gave a demonstration of the speaker and the earphones. I didn't know it at the time, but I think it was the type of telephone he originally used. So now I had a microphone and I could broadcast from upstairs to downstairs and from downstairs to upstairs using the amplifiers of my rummage sale radios. At that time, my sister Joan, who was 9 years younger than I was, must have been about 2 or 3. And there was a guy on the radio called Uncle Don that she liked to listen to. He had sing little songs about good children and so on. And he had read cards sent in by parents telling that Mary so and so is having a birthday this Saturday at 25 Flatbush Avenue. One day, my cousin Frances and I sat Joan down and said that there was a special program she should listen to. Then we ran upstairs and we started to broadcast. This is Uncle Don. We know a nice, very nice little girl named Joan who lives on New Broadway. She's got a birthday coming, not today, but such and such. She's a cute girl. We sang a little song and then we made music. I don't know. We went through the whole deal and then we came downstairs. How was it? Did you like the program? It was good, she said. But why did you make the music with your mouth? One day I got a telephone call. Mister, are you Richard Feynman? Yes. This is a hotel. We have a radio that doesn't work and would like it repaired. We understand you might be able to do something about it. But I am only a little boy, I said. I don't know how. Yes, we know that, but we'd like you to come over here anyway. It was a hotel that my aunt was running, but I didn't know that. I went over there with, they still tell the story, a big screwdriver in my back pocket. Well, I was small, so any screwdriver looked big in my back pocket. I went up to the radio and tried to fix it. I didn't know anything about it, but there was also a handyman at the hotel, and either he noticed or I noticed a loose knob on the rheostat to turn up the volume so that it wasn't turning the shaft. He went off and filed something and fixed it up so it worked. The next radio I tried to fix didn't work at all. That was easy. It wasn't plugged in right. As the repair jobs got more and more complicated, I got better and better and more elaborate. I bought myself a milliammeter in New York and converted it into a voltmeter that had different scales on it by using the right lengths, which I calculated, of very fine copper wire. It wasn't very accurate, but it was good enough to tell whether things were in the right ballpark at different connections in those radio sets. The main reason people hired me was a depression. They didn't have any money to fix their radios, so they hear about this kid who would do it for less. So I'd climb on roofs to fix antennas and all kinds of stuff. I got a series of lessons of ever-increasing difficulty. Ultimately, I got some job like converting a DC into an AC set. And it was very hard to keep the hum from going through the system. And I didn't build it quite right. I shouldn't have bitten that one off, but I don't know. One job was really sensational. I was working at the time for a printer, and a man who knew that printer knew I was trying to get jobs fixing radios. So he sent a fellow around to the print shop to pick me up. The guy is obviously poor. His car is a complete wreck. And we go to his house, which is in a cheap part of town. On the way, I say, "What's the trouble with the radio?" He says, "When I turn it on, it makes a noise. And after a while, the noise stops and everything's all right. But I don't like the noise at the beginning." I think to myself, what the hell if he hasn't got any money? You'd think he could stand a little noise for a while. And all the time on the way to his house, he's saying things like, "Do you know anything about radios? How do you know about radios? You're just a little boy." He's putting me down the whole way, and I'm thinking, so what's the matter with him? So it makes a little noise. But when we got there and I went over to the radio and turned it on, little noise? Oh my God. No wonder the poor guy couldn't stand it. The thing began to roar and wobble. Ba, 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 ba. A tremendous amount of noise. When it quieted down and played correctly. So I started to think, How can that happen? I start walking back and forth thinking, and I realize that one way it can happen is that the tubes are heating up in the wrong order. That is, the amplifier is all hot, the tubes are ready to go, and there's nothing feeding in. Or there's some back circuit feeding in, or something wrong in the beginning part, the RF part, and therefore it's making a lot of noise, picking up something. And when the RF circuit's finally going and the grid voltages are adjusted, everything's alright. So the guy says, "What are you doing? You come to fix the radio, but you're only walking back and forth." I say, "I'm thinking." Then I say to myself, "Alright, take the tubes out and reverse the order completely in the set." Many radio sets in those days use the same tubes in different places, 212s, I think they were, or 212As. So I change the tubes around, step to the front of the radio, turn the thing on, and it's as quiet as a lamb. It waits until it heats up and then plays perfectly, no noise. When a person has been negative to you and then you do something like that, they're usually 100% the other way, kind of to compensate. He got me other jobs and kept telling everybody what a tremendous genius I was, saying, "He fixes radios by thinking." The whole idea of thinking to fix a radio, a little boy stops and thinks and figures out how to do it. He never thought that was possible. Radio circuits were much easier to understand in those days because everything was out in the open. After he took the set apart, it was a big problem to find the right screws. You could see this was a resistor, that's a condenser, here's this, that. They were all labeled. And if wax had been dripping from the condenser, it was too hot and you could tell that the condenser was burned out. If there was charcoal on one of the resistors, you knew where the trouble was. Or if you couldn't tell what was the matter by looking at it, you could test it with your voltmeter and see where the voltage was coming through. The sets were simple. The circuits were not complicated. The voltage on the grids was always about 1.5 or 2 volts, and the voltages on the plates were 100 or 200 DC. So it wasn't hard for me to fix a radio by understanding what was going on inside, noticing that something wasn't working right and fixing it. Sometimes it took quite a while. I remember one particular time when it took the whole afternoon to find a burned out resistor that was not apparent. That particular time, it happened to be a friend of my mother, so I had time. There was nobody on my back saying, "What are you doing?" Instead, they were saying, "Would you like a little milk or some cake?" I finally fixed it because I had and still have persistence. Once I get on a puzzle, I can't get off. If my mother's friend had said, "Never mind, it's too much work," I'd blown my top because I want to beat this damn thing. As long as I've gone this far, I can't just leave it after I found out so much about it. I have to keep going to find out ultimately what is the matter with it in the end. That's a puzzle drive. It's what accounts for my wanting to decipher Mayan hieroglyphics or trying to open safes. I remember in high school during my first period, a guy would come to me with a puzzle in geometry or something which had been assigned to his advanced math class. I wouldn't stop until I figured the damn thing out. It would take me 15 or 20 minutes. But during the day, other guys would come to me with the same problem and I'd do it for them in a flash. So for one guy to do it took me 20 minutes, while there were 5 other guys who thought I was a super genius. So I got a fancy reputation. During high school, every puzzle that was known to man must have come to me. Every damn crazy conundrum that people had invented, I knew. So when I got to MIT, there was dance. One of the seniors had his girlfriend there and she knew a lot of puzzles. And he was telling her that I was pretty good at them. So during the dance, she came over to me and said, They say you are a smart guy, so here's one for you. A man has 8 cords of wood to chop, and I said, he starts by chopping every other one in 3 parts, because I'd heard that one. Then she'd go away and come back with another one, and I'd always know it. This went on for quite a while, and finally, near the end of the dance, she came over, looking as if she was going to get me for sure this time, and she said, a mother and daughter are traveling to Europe. The daughter got bubonic plague. She collapsed. There was hardly enough clues to get the answer to that one. It was a long story about how a mother and daughter stop at a hotel and stay in separate rooms. The next day, the mother goes to the daughter's room and there's nobody there or somebody else is there, and she says, where's my daughter? And the hotel keeper says, what daughter? And the registers got only the mother's name, and so on and so on. And there's a big mystery as to what happened. The answer is the daughter got bubonic plague, and the hotel, not wanting it to have to close up, spirits the daughter away, cleans up the room, and erases all evidence of her ever being there. It was a long tale, but I had heard it. So when the girl started out with mother and daughter traveling to Europe, I knew one thing that started that way, so I took a flying guess and got it. We had a thing at high school called the algebra team, which consists of 5 kids, and we should travel to different schools as a team and have competitions. We would sit in one row of seats, and the other team would sit in another row. A teacher who was running the contest would take out an envelope, and on the envelope it says 45 seconds. She opens it up, writes the problem on the blackboard, and says, go. So you really have more than 45 seconds, because while she's writing, you can think. Now the game was this. You have a piece of paper, and on it you can write anything. You can do anything. The only thing that counted was the answer. If the answer was 6 books, you'd have to write 6 and put a big circle around it. If what was in the circle was right, you won. If it wasn't, you lost. One thing was for sure, it was practically impossible to do the problem in any conventional, straightforward way, like putting A is the number of red books, B is the number of blue books, grind until you get 6 books. That would take you 50 seconds because people who set up the timings on these problems had made them all a trifle short. So you had to think, is there a way to see it? Sometimes you could see it in a flash, and sometimes you had to invent another way to do it, and then do the algebra as fast as you could. It was wonderful practice, and I got better and better, and I eventually got to be the head of the team. So I learned to do algebra very quickly, and it came in handy in college. When we had a problem in calculus, I was very quick to see where it was going and to do the algebra fast. Another thing that I did in high school was to invent problems and theorems. I mean, if I were doing any mathematical thing at all, I will find some practical example for which it would be useful. I invented a set of right triangle problems, but instead of giving the lengths of 2 sides to find third, I gave the difference of the 2 sides. A typical example was, there's a flagpole and there's a rope that comes down from the top. When you hold the rope straight down, it's 3 feet longer than the pole, and when you pull the rope out tight, it's 5 feet from the base of the pole. How high is the pole? I developed some equations for solving problems like that, and as a result, I noticed some connection. Perhaps it was sine squared plus cos squared is equals to 1. That reminded me of trigonometry. Now, a few years earlier, perhaps when I was 11 or 12, I had read a book on trigonometry that I had checked out from the library, but the book was by now long gone. I remember only that trigonometry had something to do with the relations between sines and cosines. So I began to work out all the relations by drawing triangles, and each one I proved by myself. I also calculated the sine, cosine, and tangent of every 5 degrees, starting with a sine of 5 degrees as given, by addition and half angle formulas that I had worked out. A few years later, when we studied trigonometry in school, I still had my notes and I saw that my demonstrations were often different from those in the book. Sometimes, for a thing where I didn't notice a simple way to do it, I went all over the place till I got it. Other times, my way was most clever. This standard demonstration in the book was much more complicated. So sometimes I'd had them beat, but and sometimes it was other way around. While I was doing all this trigonometry, I didn't like the symbols for sine, cosine, tangent, and so on. To me, sine f looked like s times I times n times f. So I invented another symbol, like a square root sign that was a sigma with a long arms sticking out of it, and I put the f underneath. For the tangent, it was a tau with the top of the tau extended, and for the cosine, I made a kind of gamma, but it looked like a little bit like the square root sign. Now the inverse sign was the same sigma, but left to right reflected, so that it started with a horizontal line with the value underneath and then the sigma. That was the inverse sign, not sine inverse f. That was crazy. They had that in books. To me, sine inverse means 1 by sine, the reciprocal, so my symbols were better. I didn't like fx. That looked to me like f times x. So I also didn't like dy by dx. You have a tendency to cancel the d's. So I made a different sign, something like an ampersand sign. For logarithms, it was a big L extended to the right. With the thing, you take the log of inside and so on. I thought my symbols were just as good, if not better, than the regular symbols. It doesn't make any difference what symbols you use, but I discovered later that it does make a difference. Once when I was explaining something to another kid in high school, without thinking, I started to make these symbols. And he said, "What the hell are those?" I realized then that if I'm going to talk to anybody else, I'll have to use the standard symbols. So I eventually gave up my own symbols. I had also invented a set of symbols for the typewriter, like Fortran has to do. So I could type equations. I also fixed typewriters with paper clips and rubber bands. The rubber bands didn't break down like they do here in Los Angeles. But I wasn't a professional repairman. I just fixed them so that it would work. But the whole problem of discovering what was the matter and figuring out what you have to do to fix it, that was interesting to me, like a puzzle.